Let me show you a magazine cover that I am old enough to remember. This is from 1989, the cover of the Atlantic magazine, which was one of the most important magazines in America, monthly, containing Japan. What that reflects is what was very much the mood of the time in America. There was this idea that Japan posed this huge threat. A lot of people talked about it as mainly an economic threat, economic dominance, but there was a concern about actual war eventually breaking out. There was a book called The Coming War with Japan, published in 1991. The reason I bring this up is because that mood reminds me very much of the mood now about China. There is great concern about China's sheerly economic power. First of all, here, in fact, is a banner headline from today's New York Times. China's global trade surplus hits a record. It's worth a headline. I'm not sure that, it would have gotten a banner across the business page 10 years ago, back when we were less concerned about China, but we are very concerned about China now. And there are a lot of ways in which China does merit a certain kind of concern, but I do think it's worth looking back and asking what happened to the great Japanese threat when everyone was freaked out because they were running such a large trade surplus, were buying up golf courses like Pebble Beach, I think Rockefeller Center. I think most of those things they wound up losing money on, but at the time it was considered, some kind of affront to American dignity that somebody other than us would own certain golf courses. And it was just freaking us out, okay? Japan was the great peril of the day, according to the average American commentator. So that's 1989, 90, 91. Okay, so let's see. What time is it? Oh, it's 35 years later. I don't think Japan has invaded the U.S. or taken it over. In fact, it's built a number of car factories in the U.S., we worked things out. And really, Japan, not long thereafter, entered a period of kind of economic stagnation, fueled partly by demographic changes, low birth rate, a lot of stuff. Anyway, you look back now, and it would be reasonable to ask, what were we worried about? And you may say, well, okay, but Japan was a formal ally. We had military bases there. China is different. Well, yeah, but that's kind of my point. Because if we got that freaked out by a country where we had military bases and they were a very cooperative ally, that suggests that we tend to get a little too freaked out about stuff generally on the international stage. And I would submit that we're doing that with China now. China's a very different problem. It's a much more complicated problem. I don't dismiss how challenging a foreign policy issue it is, but I'm mainly saying that people of a certain age can remember when there was something approaching hysteria about the threat that Japan posed. You look back now and you're like, well, that problem just took care of itself. And in retrospect, it was really probably kind of crazy to worry about the coming war with Japan. I don't think it's crazy to worry about the coming war with China, but one reason I don't is because I think in our fear of China, we're doing a number of things that actually make war more likely. And by the way, there's some real parallels between China now and Japan then, including the demographic one, low birth rate that is posing long-term economic problems. The difference is that there's actually more evidence of it in the case of China now than there was with Japan then. Then you could have kind of seen it coming if you had done the analytical work maybe, but with China, it's already in the news that the government is trying to get people to have more kids. They're not doing it. Long-term problems, real estate crisis. There's a lot of problems. And, there's some economic handicaps China has that Japan didn't have. I mean, for example, it is, as people have noted, a repressive regime. And there is, in fact, been so much kind of heavy-handed treatment by the government of entrepreneurs because it's an authoritarian country and the regime is insecure, that some of these companies are having more trouble drawing investment than they used to have as a result of these policies. Obviously, China has a lot more people than Japan. It's a bigger economy than Japan's. Its military is now much bigger than Japan's ever was. All those things are true. I mean, China is a rising power. And that definitely poses challenges whenever you have a rising power. because it just kind of inherently demands adjustment in the global system, and people find it threatening. But I do think the nature of the challenge posed by China is misunderstood. You often hear that China wants to impose its authoritarian form of government on us. Ultimately, it wants to export it to the world. There's no good evidence of that. All the evidence is that the U.S. has spent more time trying to export its political model by a long shot than China has. And, look, I like the model of liberal democracy. If it can be exported, great, although I don't want to do it forcibly. But the fact is, China is kind of ultra pragmatic in its international relations in ways that lead it to be much more indifferent, really, to the ideology of countries it's doing business with than the U.S. is. So I just think that's like a misunderstanding. I'd love to see the evidence that China wants to turn all countries into China. Now, what China does want is the prerogatives and respect that are traditionally associated with big, powerful countries, because it is becoming one. There's no doubt about that. And I think here it would be useful to keep in mind the things that we have considered rightfully ours by virtue of our power. Monroe Doctrine. In other words, we wanted, in effect, the acknowledgement of the military dominance of our neighborhood. China wants a certain amount of that. I'm not saying it's all good that they do, but I'm saying the fact that they want it doesn't mean that they want to destroy America. It means they're acting just like America acted as it became a rising power. It wanted to exert military power in its region, have a big sphere of influence. We wanted to exert influence in international institutions. China wants to do that in the World Health Organization and everywhere else. So there are a lot of things that China does that are taken as threatening, but are actually just things rising powers do, things we did as a rising power. And the best way to ensure that those things do lead to war is to not acknowledge the fact that they are just the things that countries in China's situation do. I don't mean that we shouldn't push back against any of them. I don't mean that we shouldn't keep an eye on what they're doing in their region. And of course, Taiwan poses a unique problem. It's just unlike any other problem by virtue of the fact that it was part of China in the past. China considers it still part of China and a lot of stuff. I would like to keep China from invading Taiwan if possible. But even succeeding there, preventing war in Taiwan, I think is best done if we don't have an exaggerated idea of how much menace is posed by a lot of other things China's doing, which are things that you would expect a rising power to do, regardless of whether it's just like pure capitalist democracy or, as China is, a statist, capitalist, authoritarian country. And again, I'd rather it weren't that kind of country. I'd rather it weren't authoritarian. But I don't think, it's within our power to change that. And I guarantee you the way to change it is not to generate as much hostility as possible between the two superpowers. So I think one thing the Japan experience teaches us is that sometimes problems just go away, okay? Now, I'm not saying that the China issue, the China challenge is going to magically vanish overnight, or that it doesn't demand careful attention and carefully orchestrated and thought out policy. There are a lot of issues you got to focus on. But I do think there are a number of problems that do eventually go away unless you overreact to them, unless you misdiagnose them. There are a lot of problems in life that actually will go away unless you freak out. Human psychology is funny. You can just get into threat perception mode. You can kind of decide that somebody's a threat, an adversary, an enemy. And some of them you might as well write off. Maybe they're hopeless cases. I know people that I genuinely think belong in that category. But, the problem with getting in that mode is then you're in zero-sum mode and you don't see the opportunities for constructive engagement, win-win outcomes, playing non-zero-sum games to successful outcomes. And with China, there's just a ton of that. I mean, first of all, economic engagement has a lot of that. They have a lot of rare earth minerals and things we need, for example. Then there's a whole set of global or transnational challenges where the object of the game is to avoid the lose-lose outcome. Climate change, bioweapons. I think keeping AI from being a destructive force. There's just a ton of that stuff. And so long as we live in terror of China and see it as a threat that has to be confronted, we're very unlikely to make progress on those fronts to seize the opportunities to play the non-zero-sum games, the many and growing number of non-zero-sum games to a successful outcome. Speaking of which, if what I've said makes sense to you, I hope you'll consider subscribing to my Non-Zero newsletter, the Non-Zero podcast, where you'll find a lot of material, I think, relevant to this and relevant broadly to the challenge of playing non-zero-sum games to win-win outcomes. And of course, rate and review, smash the like button, and so on. Thank you.